The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're calling us from. So welcome to this webinar in preparation for the Nature and Culture Summit and COP14 of the Convention on Biological Diversity. My name is Marilyn. I'm going to be facilitating the workshop today. We're going to have three wonderful speakers that are going to explain to you some of the main aspects, some of the things you'll need to know before coming to the COP. So we'll already give the floor to John Scott from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity.
Good morning, everyone. This is John Scott. I'm the Senior Program Officer for Traditional Knowledge and the focal point for Indigenous peoples and local communities at the Convention on Biological Diversity. Today, we're not going into a lot of detail, but I want to try and give you an overview of what to expect at COP14 and in our three-day Summit for Nature and Culture. So you can see from our opening page that the Summit on Nature and Culture is brought to you by a huge number of partners. In particular, the government of Egypt, Italian Corporation in Cairo has assisted us, also Swede Bio, but of course we also have institutional partners, UNESCO, UNDP, the Small Grants Program. Of course, IUCN is also at the table. And most importantly, we have the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. So the summit has been brought together and by my colleague Viviana Figueroa with all of these different partners. So they're all contributing both substantively and also logistically to making sure that the summit is a great success. So today I want to give you a quick introduction to the summit and the joint program of work with UNESCO on biological and cultural diversity. Also, we'll give you an overview of issues particularly relevant to Indigenous peoples and local communities at COP14. Then we will hand over to Lucy Malenki, who is the chair of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity and also the International Indigenous Network. And she will give some views on the Indigenous vision of the post-2020 era towards the vision of humanity living in harmony with nature by 2050. So I'll hand to Lucy for that a visionary presentation there. Then we will go to our national focal point for our work in Egypt, and that will be Yusria Hamad, and Yusria will take us through the logistics for our field visit to the Ras Mohammed National Park, which is on the first day of the summit, the 22nd of November. Okay, so the summit starts on the 22nd of November, and then we have the discussions on the 23rd and the 24th, finishing with the cultural night on the 24th. So I'll take you through the summit now. Cool. Now the Summit for Nature and Culture is brought to you under the auspices of the joint program of work between UNESCO and the CBD on biological and cultural diversity. So the objectives of the summit is to bring together diverse actors working on biological and cultural diversity, or as we like to say, nature and culture, to explore what we've learned in the last decade in the joint program of work on biological and cultural diversity. So we want to consider progress made in this decade and new types of synergies between science and traditional knowledge. As you know, we've been advocating as the best possible base for ecosystem management. We need both traditional knowledge and science to be at the table as equal partners. Also, our objective is to reflect on the lessons learned from the joint program of work and to improve our understanding on the links between biological and cultural diversity for the development and implementation of the post-2020 biodiversity framework and towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. So the summit itself, because of the room size and the field trip, we have a maximum capacity of 200 participants. And we are already over capacity, and we have more people asking every day. So those of you who have registered for the summit, you're very fortunate because it's going to be the greatest event at the COP, if I can say so. Now, the summit itself will have translation in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. And also for the field trip on the 22nd, we will ask the participants to be on buses according to their language groups so that we can provide some language support to people during the field trip. So the summit, of course, begins with a field trip to a local protected area, and then we have a lunch with a Bedouin community in a beach area after we visit the protected area. So the summit will conclude on the evening of the 24th with a cultural night and a reception where we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Indigenous Women's Biodiversity Network and also the 25th anniversary of the Small Grants Program. Okay, the methodology for the summit is, of course, today we're having our preparatory webinars, and we've presented in French, now English, and later today in Spanish to help prepare the different participants with an overview of what to expect when they get to Egypt in the next week or so. So the summit itself, after the webinar, to prepare people, it starts on the 22nd with our field trip, which I've just described. And then that will lead to our panel discussions on the 23rd and the 24th. What the Executive Secretary of the Convention is promoting is the need for an international alliance for nature and culture in the post-2020 biodiversity framework. So a lot of our discussions will talk about the need for an international alliance for nature and culture, a broad international alliance. Okay. The summit itself on the 23rd and the 24th, of course, we start with a high-level opening, and we have some very interesting speakers, including the Executive Secretary of the Convention. And then we have some very in-depth panels to look at how do we bridge the different agendas between biology and nature. So how do we do this to prepare for the vision of the Convention, which is the vision of humanity living in harmony with nature by 2050. So part of the discussion will be what kind of actions could bring these different agendas that focus on nature and culture together. The first panel itself is a provocative panel put together by our friends in the UNDP Small Grants Program and the ICCA Consortium, which proposes a provocative question on how much does nature need? Does nature need half? And they will be looking at the half-Earth philosophy in that panel, and also efforts to document and map the global extent of Indigenous peoples and local and traditional communities, traditional territories, which are lands and waters, and also providing examples of territories and areas conserved by Indigenous peoples and local communities over long periods of time. The second panel will be looking at the connection between people and place, and it will be an exchange on possible biocultural indicators. And this work has been championed by the American Natural History Museum and supported by the Christensen Fund, also UNDP Small Grants Program. And it's a fascinating discussion on what are possible indicators for wellness, for human well-being in the post-2020 era, reflecting on our agenda of trying to bring nature and culture together in the post-2020 biodiversity framework. The third panel, which has been graciously put together by our friends at Swede Bio and the Stockholm Resilience Centre, brings together a number of human rights experts to talk about the links between human rights and healthy ecosystems. Also the need for gender and youth to be at the table if we're to achieve the Convention's vision of living in harmony with nature. The panel will also put some concrete tools and strategies on the table to better understand the social and cultural implications to the right of a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment. And as you can imagine, this is particularly important for youth. We need youth at the table, particularly for these discussions where we're talking about the future and environmental rights. Just a quick overview of our many different partners, and I'm reminded also, thanks to Italian Cooperation Department in Cairo and our wonderful national focal point, Neustria, we've managed to get T-shirts and hats for the conference, and we will be giving these out at the beginning of the field trip on the 22nd. Of November, and we've tried to include many of the logos of our partners on at least the hat, if not on the T-shirt as well. I think we have most of the logos on the hat. So I'm looking forward to being together with all of our partners and our participants in the next 10 days, I think, before we start. Now, I just want to remind ourselves that since 2011, UNESCO and the CBD have been working on identifying and promoting the links between biological and cultural diversity. And the mission of the joint program work has been to advance knowledge and strengthen the linkage between biological and cultural diversity and to enhance synergies between interlinked provisions of the Biodiversity Convention, but also the UNESCO conventions that deal with culture. So the 5 main objectives, of course, is to build bridges between the ongoing work on nature and culture, to further explore the methodological issues of bringing nature and culture together, and also to promote the collection and compilation and analysis of information and stories about on-the-ground activities that support biological and cultural diversity. Also to support and foster learning networks on biocultural approaches, and finally to further explore and raise awareness of the value of the interlinked diversity in resource management and decision making. So, as the joint program work on biological and cultural diversity was adopted up until 2020, together with our partners at UNESCO and IUCN, we've been considering a strategy for the future. And the strategy we've come up with is to announce an initiative at the high-level segment of COP14, which will be the 15th of November, and that is an initiative towards establishing an international alliance for nature and culture. Now, the aim of the alliance is to bring together parties, governments, international agencies, indigenous peoples, and local communities during the next 2 years, 2019 and 20, to consider the usefulness of an international alliance, as well as the possible elements for a program of work on nature and cultures as an integral part of the post-2020 biodiversity framework. So the goal of such an alliance is to bring about a coming together of, or a rapprochement of nature and cultures in the post-2020 era to achieve the global vision of humanity living in harmony with nature by 2020. So the launch of the International Alliance, the launch of the initiative towards the International Alliance will be made on the 15th at the high-level segment of COP14. We're hoping that the outcome of the summit will also strengthen the call for an international alliance for nature and culture. So, thank you. The second part of my presentation, we won't be going into a lot of detail, but you're welcome to ask some questions, is looking at the preparations for the 14th meeting, and of course the biosafety protocol and the Nagoya protocol. They're COP-MOPs, members of the protocol, conference of the parties is what those acronyms stand for. So let me take you through the next, our very busy November. This diagram looks at all the activities from the 13th to the 19th of November. And for the Indigenous peoples and local communities, it's extremely important that you pay attention to the events that will go on in parallel. As you know, COP14 and the governing bodies of the two protocols will meet in a combined meeting. So this, there's a lot of challenges, of course, in following the very dense agendas in front of us. So this, through this, you'll see the high-level segment happens early in the COP on the 14th and 15th. Additionally, the 15th and the 16th are usually the preparatory meetings for the government, regional groups, and Indigenous peoples and local communities. Also the NGOs, women, and the other caucuses. You can see that our summit also occurs over the 3 middle days of the COP, the 22nd, 23rd, and the 24th. And then the COP continues, of course, from Sunday the 25th onwards. Here we have a list of the meetings from our website. As you can see, all of our documents are available on the website now to help you prepare. And we have the 14th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, also the 9th meeting of the Conference of the Parties for the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, and the 3rd meeting of the Conference of the Parties for the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. These 3 agendas are running together at the COP. Just before the COP starts, of course, during the high-level segment, the high-level segment, of course, will include representatives from Indigenous peoples. I believe Lucy Malinki, also the Permanent Forum member, Anne Nogren, Indigenous woman from Sami in Finland, will be speaking at the launch of the initiative towards International Alliance on the 15th of November at the high-level segment. We also have an Indigenous colleague participating in the Business and Biodiversity Forum, and that is Ronaldo Morales. He'll be representing the Indigenous voices at the Business Forum. The Indigenous, of course, will come together for the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity and the Indigenous Women's Biodiversity Network for their preparatory meetings on the 15th and 16th, and the COP will open on the 17th of November. Indigenous should prepare an opening statement, and they should also consider electing a 7-person bureau so that you can interact with the bureaus of the Conference of the Parties during this meeting. And this mechanism has been put in place to enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples at this COP. So, of course, usually the International Indigenous Forum only puts together the Bureau for the Working Group on HA, but now we're doing this as a standard practice. So the IIFB is encouraged to put together a bureau during its preparatory meetings on the 15th and 16th of November. All the decisions, this is a diagram that shows the flow of the recommendations before the COP. Before the COP, we have all the draft decisions and recommendations that have come out of the subsidiary bodies. And the subsidiary bodies include the Working Group on Article 8J, and the last meeting was the 10th meeting. Also the subsidiary body on implementation, which had its 2nd meeting in June this year, and also the 2 SUBSTA meetings, the Scientific and Technical Advice Bureau, its 21st and 22nd meetings. So most of the decisions before the COP have been considered at other subsidiary bodies. And this is extremely important to remember because in general, at this COP, the chairs of the meetings and the two working groups will be encouraging parties not to reopen clean text that has been already considered at subsidiary bodies. And this will be a general working method throughout the whole COP so that we can get through the mountain of work in front of us. So it's important to remember that this is what the chair will be recommending as the modus operandi of the COP, that we don't reopen things, clean text that has been looked at subsidiary bodies. Okay, let me take you briefly through the agenda of the COP, but I'm going to focus on the agenda items that are most relevant to Indigenous peoples. At the same time, the whole of the agenda, of course, is relevant to a degree. You notice items 1 to 7 are not on this PowerPoint slide because they are procedural agenda items such as agreeing on the plan of work and appointing the officers such as the rapporteur for the meeting. So the real work starts at item 8. We'll look at progress in the implementation of the convention. As you know, the progress with involving Indigenous peoples and local communities in the National Biodiversity and Action Plans in the most recent progress report has been quite poor. I think only about 20% of countries are mentioning Indigenous peoples and local communities in their national reports and in their NBSAPs. So of course this is important to emphasize the importance of Indigenous participation in the implementation of the convention at the national level. Now I want to draw your attention to agenda item 9 on resource mobilization. There are two decisions here that are very relevant to Indigenous peoples and were considered at the 10th meeting of the Working Group on 8J and the 2nd meeting of the subsidiary body on implementation. And that is advice on how to value the collective actions of Indigenous peoples and local communities in national financial reporting. And the second one is advice on safeguards in biodiversity financing that protect the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So it's important that the IIFB, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, consider those two items under resource mobilization. The second article, which is agenda item, is agenda item 10, which is always very important to Indigenous peoples and local communities, and that is our work on capacity building and also our work on Articles 17 and 18 of the Convention, which include scientific and technical cooperation. I want to jump now to agenda item 13, which is enhancing the integration under the Convention and its protocols with respect to access and benefit sharing, biosafety, and Article 8J and related provisions. This is particularly important for Indigenous peoples and local communities because under item 13, we're looking at proposals for institutional arrangements for Indigenous peoples and local communities in the post-2020 UN Biodiversity Framework. How will Indigenous peoples and local communities participate in the Convention and its bodies after 2020? And also possible elements of work for a fully integrated program of work of relevance to Indigenous peoples in the post-2020 era. So under that item, they will look at the process forward to deciding about future work and institutional arrangements. There is a proposal on the table by the EU in the compilation of views on future work, which suggests an expert group meeting, and that will probably be added to the draft decision to be adopted at the COP. So from there, I'd like to go on straight on to item 14. Article 14, Agenda Item 14, cooperation with other conventions, international organisations and initiatives. Underneath that, there is a decision welcoming the continued discussions with UNESCO towards our work on nature and culture. So there's, just to be aware, there is a specific decision there that a draft decision we could keep our eye on. Now I want to jump to agenda item 18 on digital sequencing information regarding genetic resources. This is a very technical issue, but it's very important to the Nagoya Protocol, and it's very important to the future of the Nagoya Protocol. At the moment, and I'm simplifying this and paraphrasing, the parties to the Nagoya Protocol are having a deep discussion on whether data derived from genetic resources should be included within the Nagoya Protocol framework or should not be included. This is a very important moment for the Nagoya Protocol, and the parties need to find some way forward on this issue. There is a real danger, for instance, in the future Nagoya Protocol, if digital sequencing information is not included, or in general information derived from genetic resources, that this would therefore not be regulated. And if industry moves away from genetic resources to use only digital information, this could have a detrimental effect on the Nagoya Protocol. And then we move back into an international situation where this may not be regulated. So it's important that Indigenous peoples are following the discussion on what we call DSI, digital sequencing information. Sorry, this is a lot of information, but you can see we have a very long agenda. But I just want to draw your attention to one more agenda item, and that is, of course, Article 8J and related provisions, which is our work on traditional knowledge and customary sustainable use. The program of work for Article 8J is wrapping up our work for this decade, and before the COP we have the draft guidelines on the repatriation of traditional knowledge, and we also have a glossary of key terms, key terms. Yes, we can go to the next slide. These two guidelines have been under discussion for the glossary for more than a decade, and the voluntary guidelines for 6 years. We're at a stage now where there's a very small number of brackets, and we're going to try and solve these in the first reading so that they can be adopted. Also, the discussion on ways and means of the full integration of 8J, of course, this will be taken up under the other agenda item about integration. Resource mobilization also will be taken up under resource mobilization. The in-depth dialogue on thematic areas is a suggestion for a dialogue for the next working group, which is in November 2019. So there's nothing big there to worry about. And the recommendations from the Permanent Forum is a standing agenda item. So particularly under this agenda item, we need to make sure the guidelines for repatriation are adopted and the glossary is finalized. And this will complete the program of work for Article 8J so we can focus on putting together what the future work should be. Now we're skipping to, we're jumping to the Nagoya Protocol. The governing body of the Nagoya Protocol is called the COP-MOP of the Nagoya Protocol, the Conference of the Parties, members of the Protocol. There are two subsidiary organs under the Nagoya Protocol COP-MOP, and they have a capacity building advisory group. They also have an advisory group on the ABS clearinghouse mechanism, and they also have a compliance committee, which includes the representatives of at least two Indigenous and local community representatives. You see the very long agenda for the Nagoya Protocol, and of course, one thing I would like to highlight is the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity should use its usual working methods and appoint a drafting committee that can follow the Nagoya Protocol and prepare statements to make underneath the Nagoya Protocol. I won't go into any of the items here, but of course you can see item 17 is on the digital sequencing information. And that brings us to the end of a very long introduction. Sorry, we have tried to cover a lot. The only other thing I wanted to bring your attention to, and we'll send this electronically. Okay, we do have the slide. Viviana and Marie-Lynn and myself have been working with our partners and other colleagues in the Secretariat to put together a Indigenous peoples and local communities pathways flyer for COP14. And I'm not going to read all of this to you. It will be distributed electronically and we'll make some hard copies. But of course it draws your attention to the high-level segment, although most people won't arrive until after that, but also the preparatory meeting of the Indigenous and Local Community Caucus, the IIFB, also the preparatory meeting for the Indigenous Women's Biodiversity Network. Then we have the COP, the relevant agenda items, our summit on nature and culture. So anyway, this is for your information. I won't read it all to you now. And also it brings to your attention some particular events such as the Sustainable Wildlife Management Day, also our Oceans Day, which is very important to Indigenous peoples and local communities from marine environments. And we also have an agricultural day, and I think we have some Indigenous peoples from the Slow Food Movement who are participating in the Agriculture Day with some very good main messages there. So I'll stop talking now, and there's a chance for some questions and answers later. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for this really interesting information and background knowledge for preparing to COP. Now I'm going to give the floor to Lucy Mulenke, who's going to present on the vision of Indigenous people and local community for the future, so post-2020. So now I will give the floor to Lucy.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you can hear me now. One of the things that I want to start off is to thank John for his very good presentation and taking us through the program. This is interesting because then it keeps everyone on their toes to see where exactly they can follow during the conference of parties that we are going to have. Historically, Indigenous people and local communities have been working with the convention since it was ratified as early as, of course, signed in 1992 during the Earth Conference, and also ratified the years later with all other countries getting involved. And during this time, the Convention on Biological Diversity has been having quite some mechanism of engaging Indigenous people, not only in having the meetings, but also to support them financially to be able to have a voluntary fund that they can be able to participate. And we've been going on for many years, and lately, of course, looking at the new vision of the 2020 biodiversity framework, there was a need to look at it on our participation, our involvement with the convention, and see where we can be able to look at the changes and also to look at the way forward and the future. And that's how Indigenous peoples got together to start again discussing these issues. During all these discussions, we've been established as the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, and we also have the Indigenous Women Biodiversity Network to further coordinate and enhance the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities. This is a model that has really taken a good process that has brought us very close to the convention and to be able to work with different key players. Now, I also want to say that, as I said, that we've been having quite a lot of work which has already been done many years back and following different processes for further enhancing participation and also involvement. The Secretariat, the Executive Secretary was able to put in a notification, as John had mentioned earlier, to look at the future program of work on Article 8J and related provisions as part of the 2020 biodiversity framework. And during this time, the Secretariat asked governments plus other key players to look at that and bring up ideas on how Indigenous people can further continue participating. For us as Indigenous people, we were not left behind. We also started discussing this, and a lot of work was done during our meetings, especially in the last SABSTA and SBI meeting. And we were able to come up with different ideas as a group, as a forum, to be able to follow up after listening to what the governments were saying and discussing different options of what should be there for our future. And we've already been able to compile our work, and it's already there as information document for the Conference of Parties, since we know that this is going to come up, as John has already discussed, on some of the agenda items, which I don't want to go into details on them, because this is something that is critical for us, and at the same time has been well highlighted so that we can be able to contribute. At the same time, during the SABSTA and the SBI, some of the governments were also able to put in some of their recommendations, and it will be very good for people to look at the submissions that were made by both governments and other key players, because then this helps us in terms of advocating for our work and trying to look at which areas we can be able to follow in. And some of the key areas, like the comments from Australia, from EU, are very critical and are good, and also for Canada and others who are trying to support Indigenous people to make sure that we continue with our work. And if you listen to all the discussions, the whole recommendation is that the work has to continue and Indigenous people have to continue participating. And this has happened in most of the areas of Indigenous people where the governments are working with them and are involving them. And we are happy to see that quite a number of governments are key to look at the work keenly and see how we can be able to continue working together. At the same time, Indigenous people are looking at different aspects and also looking at different topics and different agenda items that are going to be discussed, because these are very critical for the future and for the post-2020 biodiversity framework. We have to look at that as Indigenous peoples and local communities to be able to understand and to be able to really contribute as effectively as possible and to give our own rich knowledge that we have. Keys of looking at issues of traditional knowledge and so on are very, very important to us. And so far, it's also good that the Indigenous people have also been having quite a good discussion and working in different, in different areas of work, and trying to make sure that they contribute as much as possible. If you look at the Aichi targets, where we have target 18, target 16, these are areas that are very crucial to us. And for example, the target 18, where it says by 2020, the traditional knowledge, innovations, and practices of Indigenous peoples and local communities relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and their customary use of biological resources are respected, subject to national legislation and relevant international obligations. This is very important because if Indigenous people continue discussing in this and getting involved as much as possible, and also giving as much contribution as we've already done in most of the work of the CBD, then even makes more people understand, makes the governments also understand why our vital role in contributing to other areas of work and using our traditional knowledge and looking at the Aichi targets and relating them, and also looking at the issues of discussions on SDGs, for example, which John had already mentioned quite clearly in his presentation. Looking at the vision, we'll want to look at it and see what do we contribute, what does traditional knowledge contribute to the SDGs, and we can see, you can relate it to so many other SDGs, like for example, Goal 1, for preserving traditional knowledge, is in related ecosystem managements, including water bodies and systems, provide the well-being of sustainable livelihood for IPLCs. And also Goal 2, preserving traditional knowledge, it ensures food diversity, where, you know, very many indigenous people are diverse in both agriculture, livestock, fisheries, and also those who use the waters in marine and so on. And this is very important because it enhances sustainability in fruit production. And it's also important to look at some of the areas like Goal 3. We are talking about looking at different development agendas, which actually help as much as possible for indigenous people to understand the agenda of the CBD, and at the same time, look at other development agendas and be able to connect them together and relate them and present them whenever they have in their work. These particular issues are always there with us in the community level, but they're never seen as if they're key to the development or to the progress of work. And that's where indigenous people really want to make sure that in the future, with the 2020 biodiversity framework, we look at them very keenly and be able to participate fully and effectively and make the governments and other key players and also the parties to the convention understand. And that's why we cannot be left behind in processes. And some of the areas I've also mentioned in this presentation is in future, we are also looking to enhance our participation and to make sure issues of ICBES, which is a scientific knowledge body that has really been working so hard to make sure that traditional knowledge is also key in terms of looking at issues of monitoring on different aspects discussed, especially on the ecosystem trends. And we are happy to say that the IFB has a working group on that particular area and has been looking at it very keenly and following the process quite keenly. So we'll see that in the future that these are some of the areas that we can be able to look at. Issues of climate change, of course, we cannot isolate them, especially when it comes to the impact of climate change to our communities and to the biodiversity and also to the natural resources that we have and that we take care of. If you look at many communities, especially the small island states and also the Pacific and also in many parts of Africa and Asia where we have all these problems with climate change, prolonged droughts, floods and so on, the impact on our resources, the impact on our biodiversity. So it's very important that we look at it, and that's why indigenous people are also keen to make sure that the knowledge process that is being undertaken not only for us in biodiversity but in climate change, that we can be able to follow it. Issues of right to farmer systems of learning and exchange, you know, looking at different seeds and working with governments and other key players and other UN agencies is very important for them to look at protecting traditional knowledge in terms of looking at plant genetics to ensure a very key way of sharing those seeds, and of course other processes as we move on in terms of conservation and 2020 biodiversity framework. And it's quite a process that we see it really coming out quite clearly for us, and also very it brings a lot of learning for us. And looking at the COP that is coming now, as indigenous peoples and local communities who are going to participate, we need to be very key to make sure that we participate in different agendas and be able to bring out some of the issues. We are already very organized in terms of looking at our preparatory meeting, where we'll be looking at different agenda items and try to assign ourselves and critically look at them. For Africa, the same, and Asia and Latin America, despite the fact that we are going to meet there as a team, we are also discussing among ourselves to make sure that we have people who are going to participate in different items. We have the Indigenous Women and Biodiversity going to celebrate 20 years. It's a long journey we have taken, and we are proud to be part of the International Forum on Biodiversity, to be part of this process of looking at issues on biodiversity, and we'll be there to be able to work with the rest of the IPLCs to make sure that we come up with a process. And I'm glad that also the agenda items that were indicated and also urging us to be able to look at them very critical, because in the past we've been able to do that work and have been able to convince the government and the parties to the convention that the future vision of 2020, we are there and we'll continue working together. And I came up with a few recommendations because of the time limit, so that we give for people to ask us questions that we are already organized, but we still want to make sure that we look at the Aichi targets very keenly. We are already talking about target 18 and 16. There are also some of the other areas which are key to us, and we want to look at them. And it's also important to mainstream the contribution of traditional knowledge to sustainable use of biodiversity, in particular agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and tourism. Just what we had discussed in COP13, we want to keep on carrying it forward and even enhance it better to look at the vision of the framework on biodiversity. And of course, bringing up some of the key areas that have not been fully discussed in the past, but are coming out very clearly, as John brought out, the agendas of issues of human rights and biodiversity, looking at nature and culture that always comes in and then disappears, comes in, and we are now looking at it in the Vision 2020 to make sure that this is something that we can push ahead. And of course, development of guidelines to provide materials and non-material support mechanism to ensure that indigenous peoples and local communities, their capacities are enhanced, and we can be able to look at our work and strengthen the institutions that are working with that. And of course, look at further materials to look at different areas, especially on Nagoya Protocol and so on. So these are the kind of recommendation that we really want to look at. And we also want to say that the governments have to really enhance and work with indigenous peoples fully, be able to work with them, call them not only to come and verify some information, but to start already planning and working with them together in compiling reports. And John has clearly indicated our disappointments of how some of the national reports are not really including indigenous peoples. It's very, very crucial that the governments realize that this is important for the biodiversity framework. And also the build capacity for indigenous people on environmental and legal instruments that are already there, and those that are also related to the international work that indigenous people have been working on. It's always good to have those instruments coordinated and related, and also creating awareness for indigenous people. And I've also talked about how it's important to give a chance to IPLCs to give their views holistically and use the human rights approach, that we really be able to make sure that no one is left behind. The human rights approach is very important because it makes sure that almost everyone is included. And as much as we look at the vision, I would also like to urge our indigenous peoples and local communities, especially those who are coming to COP for the first time. They might be overwhelmed, but IFB has put on some mechanisms that are very crucial that will be able to help them also be able to follow and continue. And I think this webinar is one of that process, which is very important. And it's also important to urge everyone to be consistent and to be able to look at the issues in a critical way, because we all bring knowledge, we all bring our expertise and our wisdom, and this is something that we are all ready to share and to discuss among ourselves, and to be able to make sure that our vision for 2020 biodiversity framework will be, really achieved in future, to be able to work with both the parties, the Secretariat and other partners wherever they are. And I think I'll stop at that, so that in any questions coming up, we'll be able to enhance what we have presented. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy, for this interesting discussion on the vision for the future. We have about 10 minutes left. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions, but first I will give the floor to Lucia from Egypt, who's going to discuss some logistical questions, but mainly discuss our visits to the Ras Mohammed National Park on the first day of the summit. So Lucia, I will give the floor to you.
Hi, show my screen. Hi, good evening, everyone. I also would like to thank Lucy and John for their great presentation. I'm Yusra Hamid. I'm the manager of the Egyptian-Italian Environmental Cooperation Project. I'll be guiding you for Ras Mohammed field visits. It's my pleasure to guide you to this visit along with my colleagues and my colleagues in the project and our colleagues in the Ras Mohammed National Park. Before I start this very quick presentation, I would like to advise you to wear very comfortable shoes because you'll be walking for some time in the park, and also wear comfortable clothes. And as John said, we'll be distributing t-shirts and hats for you, but also we'll distribute a map that presents the protected areas of Egypt. We do have 30 protected areas. So this will be a very useful map for you that tells you more information about Ras Mohammed National Park and also all the 30 protected areas of Egypt, what kind of natural resources they have, and also the local communities and local inhabitants that live in these protected areas. The Ras Mohammed National Park is the first declared national park in Egypt, and it was declared in 1983. It covers 850 kilometers squares, and I think about 135 kilometers squares of which are on the land, and the rest are on the marine. The Ras Mohammed National Park includes diversity of terrestrial and marine life. In the screen, you can see scientific background and about Ras Mohammed, where it is located in the meeting point of Gulf of Aqaba and Gulf of Suez, and then it meets the open sea of the Red Sea. But what I would like to add here is that it is considered as an important bird area, where you can see plenty of migratory birds. And on the land side, you can see ibex and foxes and insects in the night. Of course, you won't be able to see the ibex and fox during the daytime because because the ibex are active on certain times, and also because of the visitors and tourists. So, as you know, wild animals do not show much where many people are around, but it has also a variety of wild plants, and it is a very good destination for tourism, as it is one of the best attraction tourism sites in Egypt, and also the traditional tribal community of South Sinai, especially a tribe called the Muzena tribe. They use the national park for different purposes like campsites, and they serve traditional foods and handicrafts in this national park. Here is the map of the destination that we were going to visit. So you have Sharm el-Sheikh, and in the bottom you can see Ras Mohammed National Park. We will start our visit at 9 a.m. in the morning. After you register for the summit, then we will move in 5 large buses to the park, where it will take from 45 minutes to 1 hour to reach our destination. We will have 4 different sites that we'll visit. In the top of the map, you can see the Park Visitor Center, which was planned to be our first stop, but unfortunately, because of the official opening on the next day, so this site is closed on the 22nd to prepare the site for the official visit. So our visit will start from the second stop, which is the Rook Gate, which I'm going to show you a picture of it in a minute. Here here is the main gate of Ras Muhammad. Then this is the rock gate. It will take about 10 minutes on the asphalt road to reach this rock gate. It has a very nice landscape. From one side, it's a mountain, and from the other side, it's sea. If we are lucky enough, we'll be able to see some birds in this side, but it has very nice scene, and you can take nice pictures there. My colleagues from Ras Muhammad National Park will explain a lot about the attractions and the biodiversity in each site that we are going to visit. Then we'll move to the mangrove site, which is a very beautiful site, as you can see from the images. And you can, my colleagues will explain about the mangrove and how it grows in the salt water, the different roots of these plants, and also the traditional uses for the local communities. It's a very nice site too, and you can take lots of pictures and you can enjoy the nice weather in these sites. Then we'll move to the canyon, or the hidden bay, which is considered as the core area of Ras Muhammad, and they will explain also, they will give also more scientific information about the earthquakes and how it happened and how it created this hidden bay on this side. Then we'll move to the campsites. As you can see from this image, here we have only one tent, but now they have more tents and larger ones, where you have nice shades, and you will find lots of handicrafts from South Sinai, but we'll also bring local communities from different destinations in Egypt to display their handcrafts. Then you can enjoy different cultures from Egypt, from the Red Sea, from the Western Desert, and South Sinai, and perhaps the Delta as well. And finally, I'm showing you some images from Ras Muhammad National Park. You can see the colored fish and the beautiful coral reefs. And perhaps after we take our lunch in the campsite, you will be served a traditional Bedouin food and traditional coffee and tea. Then, if you have time, if you like, you can swim and enjoy the coral reefs and the fish in this site. And yeah, I think that's all from me. And if you have any questions, I'm ready to answer. And also, if you have any vegetarians, please let me know so we can prepare vegetarian meals for them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yusria. So to conclude the webinar, we got a number of questions written. So John is going to try to give an answer compiling those different questions in a long answer. So I'll give the floor to John.
Thanks, everyone. We have quite a few questions. Patrice, I see that you've asked quite a number of questions, and soon we'll be together so we can talk about these bilaterally. But you mentioned the theme of the COP, investing in biodiversity for people and planet. One of the reasons that the Bureau and the Executive Secretary chose this theme is to better engage the private sector, and particularly those sectors of society, infrastructure, water, etc., that are doing a lot of damage to biodiversity. So the idea is to have those people at the table. And this is why during the high-level segment, there will also be a meeting with the private sector called Business and Biodiversity. A lot of the questions, of course, we can talk bilaterally when we're in Egypt in a little over a week. Also, we have Ronaldo Morales, who's an indigenous expert from Peru, And Ronaldo was mentioning the consistent use of Indigenous peoples in our text. And we can talk more about that at COP. A lot of it is decided by UN editor. And of course, using Indigenous peoples was a decision that was only made in the last 5 years. So sometimes we have the capitals, sometimes we don't. And let's talk about that more when we're face to face in Egypt. Also, somebody asks, for those who can't participate, will there be a report? Yes, there will be a report of the summit and the panels at the summit, as well as a declaration of the main messages. And the declaration will also be presented to the plenary in the second week. So that's a summary of the written questions. We'll just go to some of the live questions. Thank you.
So now I see that Amber Lindstedt, I'm sorry if I pronounced it wrong, has hand risen, so I'll give you the floor for a question. Amber? Hello, Amber? Okay, so I think
Okay. At this stage, we have no more questions. So, sorry, there was one question from Eva where she asks, how do Indigenous peoples and local communities stay up to date with the Indigenous preparations during the COP? Just to let you know that Indigenous peoples and local communities will meet for a preparatory meeting on the 15th and 16th of November at the conference site, and those rooms will be announced when you reach the conference center on the TV screens. On those 2 days also, all the regional government groups will meet for their preparatory meetings. The Indigenous will come together under the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity and the Indigenous Women's Biodiversity Network. And in those 2 days, excuse me, they will set up drafting committees to follow all the different agenda items so that the different drafting committees can prepare statements for the entire IIFB to agree to. The IIFB also meets every morning before the COP starts. The formal hours of the COP are 10 to 1 and 3 till 6. So every morning the International Indigenous Forum will meet to share the draft statements and to plan for the days ahead. Lucy, of course, is one of the chairs of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, and her and Romero from Guatemala are the co-chairs, and they will be available to help Indigenous peoples to participate in the COP.
thank you. So this concludes the webinar for today. I want to thank the presenters, John, Lucy, and Yusria for their intervention today. We're happy to respond to more questions written before COP, but also you will have the opportunity at COP itself. The audio recording of the webinar will also be available on the Nature and Culture Summit website. So thank you all for attending, and I wish you a good end of your day.